Have you ever felt rejected, abandoned by those who were supposed to love you? Today, I'm going to tell you a story that will change your perspective forever. Imagine a baby, the son of a prostitute, growing up amidst scorn, being expelled from home by his own brothers, and yet becoming the greatest leader of Israel. Does it seem impossible? Well, that's exactly what happened with Jephthah, a man who turned his deepest wound into his greatest purpose. And you know what's even more impressive? The same God who transformed his story can transform yours. My brothers and sisters, rejection is one of the deepest pains that can reside in the human heart. How many of us carry the scars of abandonment? How many grew up hearing that they were unworthy, that they didn't deserve love, that they were a mistake? The story I'm about to share is about a man who knew this pain from his very first breath. Jephthah was born marked by stigma. The son of a prostitute from Gilead, he grew up as a blemish in the history of a respectable family. His half-brothers, children of the legitimate wife, couldn't stand his presence. And if that daily scorn wasn't enough, they did the unthinkable. They expelled him from home, denying him even the right to the inheritance that was rightfully his. But pay close attention, because this story will show you how God can use precisely what made you suffer to transform you into an instrument of His glory. How rejection can become acceptance, how shame can turn into honor, and how abandonment can convert into a divine calling. I will show you how a man who was forced to live on the margins of society became the liberator of his people. And through this extraordinary journey, you will discover that no wound is too deep for God to use for a greater purpose. Imagine a child opening their eyes for the first time in a world where their very existence is considered a shame. This was Jephthah. His first cry wasn't celebrated with joy, but met with whispers of disapproval and looks of contempt. Gilead, his father, was a powerful man in Israel, a respected patriarch with an established family and legitimate children. But on a night of weakness, he lay with a prostitute. And from that encounter, a boy was born who would carry the weight of that moment for the rest of his life. The scriptures don't tell us much about his mother, and that silence is deafening. She was likely given up as a baby, perhaps out of necessity, perhaps due to social pressure. And so, Jephthah grew up in a home where he was constantly reminded of his origins. While his half-brothers received goodnight kisses and words of affirmation, Jephthah was given crumbs of attention. While they were proudly introduced to the community, he was kept in the shadows, like a shameful secret the family had to bear. Can you imagine what goes through a child's mind when they ask about their mother and receive only silence in response? When they realize they're treated differently from their other siblings? When they learn, still so young, that they need to make themselves invisible to be tolerated? But there was something special about Jephthah, something that not even the weight of social stigma could crush. Amidst rejection, he developed an extraordinary inner strength. Where others would see only shame, he found reasons to become stronger. Where others would hide, he learned to stand out. And perhaps it was precisely this difficult childhood that planted the seeds of leadership that would one day flourish. Because sometimes, my brothers and sisters, it is in the most challenging situations that God forges the noblest characters. It is in the fire of adversity that the strongest steel is tempered. There are moments in life that are like stab wounds to the heart, wounds so deep they seem impossible to heal. For Jephthah, that moment came when his own brothers, blood of his blood, decided that he didn't even deserve a place to call home. The scriptures reveal in Judges 11:2 that when the sons of Gilead's wife grew up, they expelled Jephthah. "You will not inherit in our father's house," they said, "because you are the son of another woman." Harsh words, cutting like razors, spoken without a hint of mercy. Imagine the scene: a young man, still in the dawn of his life, being ripped from the only home he knew. His belongings thrown out, the doors locked, and his brothers' faces hardened by prejudice and greed, watching him leave without showing any remorse. It wasn't just a material inheritance they denied him that day. They denied him the right to belong, to have a family, to carry his father's name with dignity. In a society where family was everything, where name and lineage determined one's place in the world, Jephthah was cast into the void of total exclusion. Think with me. How many nights must he have spent awake, replaying those cruel words in his mind? How many times did he wonder why God allowed him to be born into such adverse circumstances? Why brotherly love, so celebrated in the scriptures, found no place in his brothers' hearts? But there is something extraordinary about that moment of profound injustice. While his brothers thought they were writing the end of Jephthah's story, they were actually just setting the stage for one of the most impressive examples of how God turns curse into blessing. Because sometimes, my beloved, what seems like our greatest defeat is only the prelude to our greatest victory. The rejection that was supposed to destroy him was, in fact, directing him to his divine destiny, as it is written in Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And so, Jephthah, expelled from his earthly father's house, was being prepared by his heavenly Father for a mission far greater than he could have imagined in that moment of pain and solitude. What would you do if all the respectable doors of society were closed to you? For Jephthah, the answer came in the form of an unlikely rise that began on the fringes of society, in the land of Tob, where he found refuge after his expulsion. In Judges 11:3, we read that worthless men gathered around Jephthah and went out with him. But don't be mistaken in thinking it was just a band of ordinary criminals. No, my brothers and sisters. What formed there was a community of the rejected, the excluded, men who, like him, knew the bitter taste of social rejection. And it was there, among the marginalized, that Jephthah's gift of leadership began to shine. He who was rejected by his own family became a father to the fatherless. He who was expelled from his home became a shelter for the homeless. He who had no inheritance became the hope of the desperate. Think for a moment. Isn't it extraordinary how God operates? While the respectable society saw him as scum, God was using that period to develop him as a leader. In the mountains of Tob, Jephthah learned the art of military strategy, how to win men's loyalty, how to make tough decisions under pressure. He transformed a group of worthless men into a respectable military force. His leadership skills, his ability to plan, his courage in battle, all of this was being refined in the crucible of adversity. The son of a prostitute, the rejected brother, was becoming a feared and respected commander. And you know what's even more impressive? Even while living on the margins of society, the scriptures don't record a single act of revenge from Jephthah against his brothers or his hometown. He could have used his power to take vengeance, but he chose a different path. Because sometimes, my beloved, our greatest victory lies not in repaying evil, but in overcoming those who tried to destroy us. As it is written in Isaiah 61:3, God is an expert at turning ashes into a crown, and that is exactly what he was doing with Jephthah. Each day in the land of Tob was a preparation. Each battle was training. Each decision was a lesson. Because God was not just forming a leader of outlaws, he was preparing a liberator for Israel. And soon those who had rejected him would have to swallow their pride and acknowledge that the God of Israel has a very particular way of exalting the humble and humbling the exalted. God has a divine sense of irony that sometimes leaves us speechless. Imagine the scene. The elders of Gilead, likely including those same brothers who years earlier had expelled Jephthah, now making a long journey to the land of Tob. The reason? They desperately needed the one they once considered unworthy. In Judges 11:4-5, we read that the Ammonites had declared war against Israel. Panic spread among the people. And suddenly, that name that was once whispered in shame was now spoken with hope. Jephthah, the valiant warrior, the leader of the excluded. But observe Jephthah's initial response in Judges 11:7. "Don't you hate me? Didn't you drive me away from your father's house? Why have you come to me now when you are in distress?" What a moment. That was not just a question, it was the outpouring of years of suppressed pain, lonely nights, hidden tears. And here is the beauty of the character God had formed in Jephthah. Even though he had every right to refuse, even though he could have savored the sweet taste of revenge by seeing his former oppressors begging for help, he chose a greater path. Because sometimes, my brothers and sisters, true leadership is not about using power to punish, but about serving. The elders made a proposal that would change everything. "Come, be our leader." He who was not worthy to inherit with his brothers was now called to lead the entire nation. He who was expelled through the back door was being invited in through the front door, not just as a family member, but as the leader of the whole people. And see how God works. The same place from which he was expelled in shame would be the place where he would return in honor. The same people who had rejected him now hailed him as their liberator. The same house that had been denied to him as inheritance would now become the center of his leadership. In Judges 11:11, we read that Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and leader over themselves. That moment was not just a personal victory. It was a living testimony of how God exalts the humble in his perfect timing. My beloved, how many of you are waiting for your vindication? How many still carry the scars of rejection and wonder if you will ever be recognized? Jephthah's story teaches us that God not only heals our wounds, but he transforms them into testimonies of his glory. As it is written in 1 Peter 5:6, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time." God's time had come for Jephthah, but with this exaltation would also come one of the most difficult decisions of his life. Sometimes in the midst of our greatest victories, we make decisions that haunt us forever. And so it was with Jephthah, at the height of his leadership, when he made a vow that would tragically change the course of his history. In Judges 11:30-31, we find the words that fell from his lips in a moment of fervor and anxiety. "If you give me the Ammonite captives as my wages, whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in triumph will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering." Hasty words, perhaps born out of the desperate desire to prove his worth, to show his devotion to the God who had lifted him from the ashes of rejection. But oh, how could he not imagine the terrible price of that promise? Victory came, grand and complete. Jephthah, the once rejected, was now returning as a conquering hero. His heart must have been full of gratitude and joy. But then, imagine the horror when the first person to come out of his house to celebrate his victory was his only daughter, dancing with timbrels. The scriptures tell us that, upon seeing her, he tore his clothes and cried out, "Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low." What a heartbreaking moment. The man who had overcome rejection, conquered armies, and achieved glory, now faced the most painful of choices. And his daughter. Oh, what nobility of spirit. She responded, "Father, if you have really vowed to the Lord, don't delay in fulfilling it, but you will receive a blessing from the Lord." What a contrast to those brothers who had rejected him, his own daughter, willing to sacrifice her life to honor her father's word. She asked for 2 months to mourn her virginity on the mountains with her friends. 2 months of lament for a life that would not be lived, for children that would not be born, for dreams that would not materialize. And then, the vow was fulfilled. What a profound and painful lesson on the power of words. As it is written in Ecclesiastes 5:4-5, "When you make a vow to God, do not delay to fulfill it. He has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill your vow. It is better not to make a vow than to make one and not fulfill it." This story makes us reflect. How many times have our hasty words, our thoughtless promises, brought consequences we never imagined? How often, in the eagerness to prove something to someone or to ourselves, do we make vows that trap us? The powerful leader, the valiant warrior, the man chosen by God, discovered in the hardest way that not every victory comes without a price, and that sometimes our greatest battles are not against external armies, but against the consequences of our own hasty decisions. Before the tragic vow, there was a moment of extraordinary glory in Jephthah's life, his victory over the Ammonites. This was not just another battle. It was the divine confirmation of his leadership and the vindication of a man whom society had discarded. In Judges 11:12-28, we see something remarkable. Before going to war, Jephthah pursued diplomacy. He, whom many considered a mere leader of outlaws, demonstrated impressive political wisdom and historical knowledge. He sent messengers to the king of the Ammonites, presenting detailed arguments about why the disputed lands rightfully belonged to Israel. Observe the depth of his knowledge. He recounted 300 years of history, cited precedents, mentioned ancient agreements. This was not an uneducated man or a simple violent warrior. It was a leader who understood that the pen can be mightier than the sword. But when diplomacy failed, when the king of Ammon rejected his arguments, Jephthah showed his other side, the military strategist. The scriptures tell us in Judges 11:29 that the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. This was not just a human conflict. It was a divine battle. The military campaign was extraordinary. Judges 11:32-33 recounts that Jephthah advanced against the Ammonites, and the Lord delivered them into his hands. He destroyed them from Aroer to the vicinity of Minnith, and he subdued the people of Ammon before the Lord until he had wiped them out. 20 cities conquered, a victory so complete that it established peace in the region. The son of a prostitute, the rejected one, the expatriate, had become the liberator of Israel. Those who had despised him now had to acknowledge that God was with him. What a powerful lesson on how God chooses his instruments. He does not look at appearances or social status. He doesn't care about lineage or reputation. He seeks hearts willing to serve him, even if those hearts have been broken by rejection. As it is written in 1 Corinthians 1:27, "But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong." Victory over the Ammonites was more than a military conquest. It was the divine declaration that God can use anyone, no matter their past or origin, to fulfill his purposes. It was living proof that when God chooses someone, no human obstacle can thwart his plan. And perhaps, my brothers and sisters, that is exactly what we need to remember today. No matter how much the world rejects or labels us, when God calls us to a mission, he himself empowers us to fulfill it. Jephthah's story is a living testimony of how God transforms rejection into purpose, shame into glory, and scars into medals of honor. Let us draw the final lessons from this extraordinary narrative. First, we see that our origins do not determine our destiny. Jephthah was the son of a prostitute, rejected by his brothers, expelled from his inheritance. But God transformed him into a judge of Israel, a liberator of his people. As it is written in 1 Samuel 16:7, "The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Second, we learn that God has a purpose even in our rejections. Jephthah's expulsion, which seemed like a curse, was actually the path for his training as a leader. In the lands of Tob, far from the comfort of home, he developed the skills that would later be crucial in saving Israel. Third, we observe that God often uses those whom society rejects to accomplish his greatest deeds. The same people who despised him had to recognize that God was with him. As Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 1:28, "God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not, to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him." Fourth, the story teaches us about the danger of hasty promises. Jephthah's tragic vow reminds us to weigh our words carefully, especially when making promises to God. Fifth, we see that true greatness lies not in seeking revenge on those who have hurt us, but in being willing to serve even those who have rejected us. When the elders of Gilead came to ask for his help, Jephthah chose to serve instead of seeking vengeance. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Jephthah's story shows us that God is an expert at rewriting stories of rejection. He takes our scars and transforms them into testimonies. He takes our pain and turns it into purpose. He takes our rejection and turns it into redemption. My beloved brothers and sisters, perhaps some of you are going through moments of rejection right now. Maybe you feel like Jephthah, expelled, marginalized, deemed unworthy. Remember, these experiences may just be the prelude to something greater that God is preparing. As it is written in Romans 8:28, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." Jephthah's story teaches us that no rejection is too deep for God to transform into purpose. No wound too severe for him to heal. No shame too great for him to turn into glory. For in the end, it is not our origin that determines our destiny, but the God who calls us, redeems us, and uses us for his glory. May we, like Jephthah, allow God to transform our rejections into purpose, our scars into testimonies, and our pain into power to serve others. Amen.